I watched my son-in-law Derek raise his hand and strike my daughter Sarah across the face 4 times at our family dinner table. The sound echoed through my dining room like gunshots. When she tried to speak, he shoved her so hard she fell from her chair. My grandson sat frozen, tears streaming down their little faces. I stood up slowly, my blood turning to ice water. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number Derek had never heard before. He had absolutely no idea who he was dealing with. My name is Mayra, and for 30 years, I served as a federal investigator with the FBI. I've seen the worst humanity has to offer, track down criminals who thought they were untouchable, and brought justice to countless victims. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for watching someone lay hands on my own daughter in my own home. Let me take you back to the beginning, because what happened that Sunday evening didn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of years of manipulation, control, and abuse that I'd been too blind to see clearly until that moment. Sarah met Derek Thompson 5 years ago at a hospital charity gala. She was 23 then, fresh out of nursing school with dreams of working in pediatric care. Derek was 27, climbing the corporate ladder at Henderson Financial Group, one of Dallas's most prestigious investment firms. He swept her off her feet with expensive dinners, weekend trips to Napa Valley, and promises of a life filled with everything she'd ever wanted. I should have trusted my instincts from the beginning. During their courtship, Derek was charming to an almost theatrical degree. He brought me roses, complimented my cooking, and spoke eloquently about his love for Sarah. But there was something calculated about his charm, something that reminded me of the white-collar criminals I'd interrogated during my career. The way he studied people's reactions, filed away personal information for later use, and adapted his personality to match what others wanted to hear. But Sarah was glowing with happiness, and after her father died when she was 16, I wanted nothing more than to see her settled with someone who would love and protect her. Derek seemed to be that man, at least on the surface. They married in a beautiful ceremony at the Four Seasons. Derek spared no expense, flying in orchids from Hawaii and hiring a string quartet that had performed at Carnegie Hall. Sarah looked radiant in her grandmother's vintage lace dress, which I'd carefully preserved for this day. During their first dance, Derek whispered something in her ear that made her laugh and blush simultaneously. I remember thinking that maybe I'd been wrong about my initial reservations. The trouble started small, almost imperceptibly. Sarah began missing our weekly lunch dates, claiming Derek had planned surprise activities or work events that required her attendance. When she did visit, she seemed distracted, constantly checking her phone for messages from Derek. She explained that he worried about her driving alone, especially on the highway between their suburban home and my downtown apartment. After Tommy was born, the isolation intensified. Derek convinced Sarah that daycare was unsafe, that she should stay home to provide the best possible care for their son. He painted this as protective concern, not control. Sarah gave up her nursing position, a decision that broke my heart because she'd worked so hard for her degree. But Derek assured everyone that his salary was more than sufficient to support the family, and Sarah seemed content with motherhood. When Jake arrived 2 years later, the pattern deepened. Sarah rarely left the house except for grocery shopping and medical appointments, always accompanied by Derek. She stopped calling friends, claiming she was too busy with the boys. Family gatherings became the only regular contact I had with my daughter and grandsons. Our Sunday dinners began 3 years ago. Derek's idea, surprisingly. He suggested that regular family time would be beneficial for the boys, help them bond with their grandmother. Every week, Sarah would arrive at my house with homemade side dishes and the children, while Derek typically showed up later, citing work obligations or traffic delays. During these dinners, I began noticing changes in Sarah that troubled me deeply. She'd always been vibrant and opinionated, quick to laugh, and passionate about social justice issues. But gradually she became quieter, more deferential, constantly seeking Derek's approval before expressing any opinion. She developed a habit of covering her arms even during hot Texas summers, wearing long sleeves or cardigans that seemed inappropriate for the weather. The boys, while sweet and well behaved, showed signs of walking on eggshells around their father. 6-year-old Tommy would tense visibly when Derek's voice rose, and 4-year-old Jake had developed a stutter that only appeared when Derek was present. Sarah explained these behaviors as normal childhood phases, but my trained eye recognized the symptoms of children living with domestic tension. Derek's behavior toward Sarah during family gatherings was subtly controlling. He would interrupt her stories, correct her recollection of events, and make dismissive comments about her intelligence disguised as gentle teasing. When Sarah expressed interest in returning to nursing once Jake started kindergarten, Derek would launch into elaborate explanations about the dangers of the medical field, the long hours that would harm family life, and their financial security that made her employment unnecessary. 3 weeks before the incident that changed everything, Sarah arrived at Sunday dinner with a visible bruise on her collarbone. She claimed she'd fallen while carrying laundry down their basement stairs. Derek corroborated the story with precise details about finding her at the bottom of the steps, how he'd insisted on taking her to urgent care despite her protests. But something about their synchronized narrative felt rehearsed like testimony they'd practiced together. The Sunday that shattered our family's facade started normally enough. I'd prepared Sarah's favorite meal, honey-glazed ham sweet potato casserole, green bean almondine, and fresh cornbread. The boys were excited because I'd promised to show them my old photo albums after dinner. Sarah seemed unusually anxious, repeatedly smoothing her hair and adjusting her sleeves. Derek arrived 45 minutes late, claiming an emergency conference call with overseas clients. His explanation was detailed and plausible, but I noticed Sarah flinch when he described yelling at subordinates who'd made costly mistakes. During dinner, the conversation meandered through safe topics: Tommy's soccer practices, Jake's preschool art projects, and my neighbor's new golden retriever puppy. The tension escalated when Sarah mentioned her desire to return to nursing school for a master's degree in pediatric care. She spoke hesitantly, almost apologetically, as if preparing for rejection. Derek's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, and his expression shifted from mild interest to barely controlled anger. "We've discussed this, Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a warning tone that made both boys stop eating. "Your priority should be our family, not chasing unrealistic dreams that would take time away from the children." Sarah's cheeks flushed, but she persisted gently. "I've been researching online programs that would allow me to study while the boys are sleeping. We could manage the schedule without disrupting family time." Derek set down his fork with deliberate precision. "You're being selfish and impractical. Nursing school is expensive, time-consuming, and completely unnecessary. I provide everything this family needs." "I'm not questioning your ability to support us," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just miss using my education helping children who need medical care. It's what I've always wanted to do." Derek's face darkened. "What you've always wanted. What about what I want? What about what our children need? You're talking about abandoning your responsibilities for some fantasy about being a career woman." The boys had stopped eating entirely, sensing the mounting hostility. Tommy reached for Jake's hand under the table, a protective gesture that broke my heart. Sarah tried to diffuse the situation by changing the subject, asking Derek about his recent business trip to Houston. But Derek wasn't finished. He launched into a cruel monologue about Sarah's shortcomings as a mother and wife, her tendency to make poor decisions, and her inability to appreciate the sacrifices he made for the family. Each word was carefully chosen to inflict maximum emotional damage while maintaining plausible deniability. You can barely manage the household responsibilities you have now. He continued, his voice rising with each sentence. The laundry is always behind, dinner is never ready when I get home, and you let the boys watch too much television instead of engaging in educational activities. Sarah's hands trembled as she attempted to respond. I do my best with everything, Derek. If there are specific areas where you'd like me to improve, we can discuss them privately. That's when Derek exploded. He stood abruptly, towering over Sarah, who remained seated, and began screaming about her ingratitude, her stupidity, and her failure as a wife. The boys started crying, which only fueled Derek's rage. Stop crying, he shouted at Tommy and Jake. Your mother needs to learn that actions have consequences. When Sarah stood to comfort the children, Derek grabbed her wrist and yanked her back toward her chair. Sit down. We're not finished discussing your ridiculous nursing school idea. Sarah tried to pull away gently. Derek, please. The children are frightened. That's when he slapped her. The first blow snapped her head to the left, leaving a red handprint on her cheek. Before she could react, he struck her again, then twice more in rapid succession. The sound reverberated through my dining room like physical blows to my own heart. When Sarah attempted to speak to ask him to stop, Derek shoved her with both hands. She tumbled backward, her chair toppling over, and crashed to the hardwood floor. The boys were sobbing now, reaching for their mother, while remaining frozen in their seats, too terrified to move. Derek stood over Sarah's fallen form, his chest heaving with rage and adrenaline. Maybe now you'll think twice before questioning my decisions about this family. That's when I rose from my chair. 30 years of federal law enforcement had taught me to remain calm in crisis situations, to think strategically rather than react emotionally. But seeing my daughter brutalized in front of her children triggered every protective instinct I possessed. I walked slowly to the sideboard where I kept my purse, maintaining steady eye contact with Derek. My movements were deliberate, controlled, designed to project authority rather than panic. I retrieved my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed. Derek watched me with growing confusion and irritation. What are you doing, Mayra? I didn't answer. Instead, I pressed the call button and waited for the familiar voice that answered on the second ring. Patricia, it's Mayra. I need to cash in some favors. Derek stared at me in bewilderment as I spoke quietly into the phone, using terms he didn't understand: federal jurisdiction, domestic violence escalation, and financial background investigation. When I mentioned his full name and social security number, which I'd memorized from Sarah's tax documents years earlier, his confusion transformed into something approaching fear. Who are you calling? He demanded, but I held up one finger, silencing him while I finished providing details to my former partner. Agent Patricia Flores had worked financial crimes with me for 15 years before I retired. She understood my communication style, knew that when I called using our old case codes, the situation was both urgent and serious. Within 3 minutes, she'd agreed to run a comprehensive background check on Derek Thompson and flag his accounts for suspicious activity monitoring. After ending the call, I helped Sarah to her feet, while Derek stood frozen, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. Sarah's left cheek was swollen and darkening, but she seemed more concerned about comforting Tommy and Jake than addressing her own injuries. Boys, why don't you go to the playroom and watch cartoons while the adults talk? I suggested, gently keeping my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest. Derek found his voice as the children reluctantly left the dining room. You had no right to involve outsiders in our family business. This is between Sarah and me. I turned to face him directly, allowing my federal investigator persona to surface completely. When you commit assault and battery in my home in front of minor children, it becomes everyone's business, especially mine. Assault and battery, Derek scoffed. I disciplined my wife for disrespecting our marriage. That's not a crime. Actually, it is. In Texas, domestic violence is a Class A misdemeanor for first offense punishable by up to 1 year in jail and a $4,000 fine. Given that you struck Sarah multiple times, the charges could be elevated to felony assault. Derek's bravado wavered slightly. You're overreacting. Sarah understands that I was frustrated. She provoked me by bringing up nursing school after we'd already settled the matter. I glanced at Sarah, who was holding ice from my freezer against her swollen cheek. Her silence spoke volumes about her fear and Derek's pattern of intimidation. Sarah, do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight? She's staying with me, Derek interrupted. We're going home to discuss this situation privately. No, I said firmly. Sarah and the boys are staying here tonight. You're leaving. Derek's face flushed with anger. You can't keep me from my family. I have legal rights as Sarah's husband and the boys' father. And Sarah has legal rights to be safe from domestic violence. If you attempt to remove her or the children from this house against their will, I'll have you arrested for kidnapping and violation of protective custody. I was bluffing about protective custody, but Derek didn't know enough about family law to challenge my assertion. He looked between Sarah and me, calculating his options and finding them limited. This isn't over, he finally said, pointing at Sarah. You're my wife, and you'll come home when you're ready to apologize for embarrassing me in front of your mother. After Derek left, slamming the front door hard enough to rattle the windows, Sarah collapsed onto my sofa and began crying in earnest. The boys emerged from the playroom cautiously, having heard the door slam, and climbed onto the couch to comfort their mother. I'm sorry, Sarah whispered through her tears. I never wanted you to see him like that. I never wanted the boys to see him like that. I sat beside her and carefully examined the bruises forming on her face and neck. How long has this been happening? 2 years, she admitted, her voice barely audible. It started after Jake was born. Derek said I wasn't managing the household efficiently, that I was letting the children become spoiled and disrespectful. As Sarah spoke, I learned the horrifying extent of Derek's control over her life. He monitored her phone calls and text messages, controlled all bank accounts and credit cards, and had convinced her that her family and friends couldn't be trusted. He'd systematically isolated her from every support system except our weekly dinners, which he allowed, only because refusing would have raised suspicions about his behavior. He takes my driver's license with him to work. Sarah continued, rolling up her sleeves to reveal finger-shaped bruises on her forearms. He says it's for my protection, that I'm accident-prone and might hurt myself or the children if I drive unsupervised. The pattern was textbook domestic abuse, isolation, financial control, psychological manipulation, and escalating physical violence. Derek had spent years grooming Sarah to accept his authority and doubt her own judgment. But tonight he'd made a critical mistake by revealing his true nature in front of a trained federal investigator. While Sarah put the boys to bed in my guest room, I began documenting everything. I photographed her injuries from multiple angles, noting the size and pattern of the bruises. I wrote detailed descriptions of Derek's assault, his exact words, and the children's reactions. Most importantly, I activated recording apps on my phone and installed backup cloud storage for any future evidence. Patricia called back at 11:30 that evening with preliminary findings that confirmed my worst suspicions. Derek Thompson had been living far beyond his legitimate means, with credit card debts exceeding $40,000 and a mortgage payment that consumed 60% of his declared income. More troubling, he'd been opening new credit accounts using Sarah's social security number without her knowledge or consent. Mayra, This guy's financial situation is a house of cards, Patricia explained. He's been juggling minimum payments for months. There's also some irregularity in his employment records. Henderson Financial Group shows him as a junior associate, but his tax returns claim senior management income levels. What about criminal history? Clean on paper, but I ran his name through our domestic violence database. 3 different women have filed reports against him over the past 8 years. Charges were always dropped before prosecution, usually after the women received expensive gifts and promises of behavioral change. I felt sick thinking about Derek's previous victims and how Sarah had unknowingly become the latest target in a pattern of abuse. Can you monitor his financial activity going forward? Already in motion. Any large transactions or account changes will trigger alerts. I'm also running background checks on his family members and known associates. If there's a broader conspiracy here, we'll find it. The next morning, while Derek was at work, I drove Sarah to her house to collect essential items for herself and the boys. We moved quickly and efficiently, packing clothes, medications, and important documents. Sarah seemed nervous about being in her own home, constantly checking her phone for messages from Derek and jumping at every sound. While Sarah packed upstairs, I examined Derek's home office, looking for evidence of financial fraud or additional controlling behaviors. His desk was meticulously organized with files labeled for household expenses, investment tracking, and tax preparation. But hidden behind his computer monitor, I found a notebook filled with handwritten observations about Sarah's daily activities, moods, and conversations with other people. The notebook entries were disturbing in their detail and clinical tone. Derek had been documenting Sarah's behavior, like a scientist studying a lab specimen, noting when she seemed defiant or unstable, and recording his methods for correcting her attitude. Most chilling were his recent entries about Sarah's deteriorating mental health and his concern about her ability to care for the children safely. I photographed every page of the notebook before returning it to its hiding place. This documentation would be crucial evidence if Derek attempted to claim that Sarah was mentally unstable or an unfit mother. It also revealed a level of premeditation that elevated his abuse from impulsive violence to calculated psychological warfare. When we returned to my house, I called my family attorney, Jennifer Walsh, and scheduled an emergency consultation for the following morning. Jennifer specialized in high-conflict divorces and had experience with cases involving domestic violence and financial fraud. I knew Sarah would need aggressive legal representation to protect herself and her children from Derek's inevitable retaliation. That afternoon, Patricia called with additional disturbing information. Her investigation had revealed that Derek's mother, Linda Thompson, was a nurse practitioner with access to prescription medications. Linda had a history of minor disciplinary actions from the Texas Board of Nursing, including allegations of inappropriate medication distribution and failure to maintain proper patient records. I'm concerned about potential medical abuse, Patricia explained. If Derek's been documenting Sarah's supposed mental health issues and his mother has access to psychiatric medications, they might be working together to create evidence of Sarah's instability. The pieces were starting to form a terrifying picture. Derek wasn't just an abusive husband. He was potentially part of a calculated scheme to destroy Sarah's credibility and gain complete control over her life and their children. But now he was dealing with someone who understood federal investigation techniques and had the resources to expose his criminal activities. I spent that evening researching Texas laws regarding parental rights protective orders and the admissibility of domestic violence evidence in custody proceedings. Knowledge would be our weapon against Derek's manipulation and legal maneuvering. He'd controlled Sarah through isolation and fear, but he was about to discover that some opponents couldn't be intimidated or deceived. The next phase of my investigation would require careful coordination with law enforcement, legal professionals, and child protection services. Derek had spent years building his facade of respectability, but facades crumble when subjected to thorough scrutiny. He'd targeted the wrong family, and he was about to learn the consequences of that mistake. Patricia's follow-up call the next morning confirmed my worst fears and revealed a conspiracy far more sinister than I'd initially imagined. Her financial crimes unit had been monitoring Derek's accounts overnight, and the activity patterns were deeply disturbing. "Mayra, we've got a problem," Patricia began without preamble. "Derek's been moving money in ways that suggest he's planning something major. Since your call yesterday, he's liquidated his retirement account, transferred funds to offshore accounts, and applied for a second mortgage on the house he shares with Sarah. But the financial irregularities were just the beginning." Patricia's team had discovered that Derek's employment situation was built on fraudulent credentials. He'd never actually graduated from the MBA program listed on his resume, and his claimed work experience at prestigious financial firms was fabricated. Henderson Financial Group had hired him based on forged documents and fake references. "How has he been getting away with this for 5 years?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "He's been embezzling client funds to maintain his lifestyle and cover his lies. We're talking about systematic theft spanning multiple client accounts. The total amount exceeds $600,000. The scope of Derek's criminal activities was staggering, but Patricia's next revelation was even more chilling. Derek's mother, Linda Thompson, wasn't just passively supporting her son's deception. She was an active participant in a scheme that reached far beyond financial fraud. Linda had been stealing prescription medications from the medical practice where she worked, specifically psychiatric drugs, including sedatives, antidepressants, and antipsychotics. Security footage from her workplace showed her accessing the medication storage area during off hours and removing controlled substances without proper documentation. "We think Derek and Linda have been drugging Sarah," Patricia explained. "The medications Linda's been stealing are exactly the type that would cause the symptoms Derek's been documenting: confusion, memory problems, mood swings, and behavioral changes." I felt nauseated thinking about the implications. For months, possibly years, Derek and his mother had been systematically poisoning my daughter while simultaneously documenting her drug-induced symptoms as evidence of mental illness. It was medical gaslighting on a criminal level. Patricia's investigation had also uncovered the legal framework Derek was constructing around Sarah's supposed mental health crisis. He'd been consulting with a private psychiatric facility that specialized in involuntary commitments, providing them with his fabricated documentation of Sarah's deteriorating condition. Linda had used her medical credentials to support Derek's claims, creating false medical records that painted Sarah as increasingly unstable and potentially dangerous to herself and her children. "They've already filed preliminary paperwork for emergency psychiatric commitment," Patricia continued. "According to the timeline in their documentation, they were planning to execute this within the next 2 weeks. The plan was diabolical in its sophistication. Once Sarah was committed to psychiatric care, Derek would gain legal custody of Tommy and Jake. As her husband, he'd have the authority to make medical decisions about her treatment, potentially keeping her institutionalized indefinitely. Meanwhile, his embezzled funds would be safely hidden in offshore accounts, and he'd be free to start a new life with his girlfriend, Candace Walsh. I'd initially assumed Candace was an innocent victim of Derek's deception, but further investigation revealed she was aware of the affair and Derek's plans to leave Sarah. Candace worked in the same department as Derek at Henderson Financial Group and had been receiving expensive gifts paid for with stolen client funds. While she might not have known about the criminal conspiracy, she was certainly benefiting from it. The timing of Derek's assault on Sarah wasn't random or impulsive. It was a calculated escalation designed to provide additional evidence of the family's dysfunction and Sarah's inability to maintain a stable home environment. Derek probably planned to claim that Sarah had provoked the incident through erratic behavior caused by her mental illness. But Derek had made several critical mistakes. First, he'd committed assault in front of a federal investigator who understood how to document and preserve evidence. Second, he'd underestimated Sarah's support system and her mother's professional capabilities. Most importantly, his financial crimes had created a paper trail that federal investigators could follow regardless of his attempts to hide or destroy evidence. Patricia arranged for covert surveillance of both Derek and Linda using federal resources justified by the interstate nature of the financial fraud. Their phone conversations were being monitored, their digital communications were being tracked, and their physical movements were being documented. Every aspect of their conspiracy was now under federal scrutiny. Meanwhile, I focused on protecting Sarah and gathering evidence that could be used in both criminal proceedings and custody disputes. I arranged for Sarah to undergo comprehensive medical testing to document the presence of psychiatric medications in her system. The results would prove that her recent behavioral changes were chemically induced rather than symptoms of mental illness. I also contacted Dr. Michael Chen, a psychiatrist who specialized in medication-induced psychological symptoms. Dr. Chen agreed to evaluate Sarah and provide expert testimony about the effects of the drugs Linda had been administering. His professional opinion would be crucial in disproving Derek's claims about Sarah's mental state. The children required special attention as well. Tommy and Jake had been living in an environment of escalating tension and witnessing their mother's drugged confusion without understanding the cause. I arranged for them to be evaluated by Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a child psychologist who worked with domestic violence cases. Dr. Martinez would assess their emotional state and provide therapeutic support, while also documenting any statements they made about their home environment. As the evidence mounted against Derek and Linda, I began coordinating with multiple agencies to ensure their arrest would be handled properly. Patricia's federal team would take the lead on financial crimes, but local authorities would handle the domestic violence and child endangerment charges. The Texas Board of Nursing would investigate Linda's medication theft and fraudulent medical records. Social services would evaluate the children's safety and well-being. But I wanted to do more than just reactive investigation. Derek and Linda were planning to spring their trap within days, and I needed to turn their conspiracy against them. Instead of simply arresting them based on evidence we'd already gathered, I wanted to catch them in the act of implementing their scheme. I proposed a sting operation to Patricia using my house as the controlled environment where Derek and Linda would attempt to execute their plan. We'd invite them for a family reconciliation dinner, secretly recording their conversation and actions while federal agents maintained surveillance from adjacent properties. Patricia was initially concerned about the risks to Sarah and the children, but I convinced her that a controlled confrontation would provide the strongest possible evidence of their criminal intent. We'd catch them in possession of drugs intended for Sarah attempting to implement their fake mental health crisis and documenting their own criminal conspiracy. The plan required careful coordination and significant resources, but Patricia agreed to move forward. Federal agents would pose as neighbors' service workers and delivery personnel to maintain close surveillance without arousing suspicion. The house would be equipped with hidden cameras and audio recording devices to capture every word and action. Sarah would be replaced by an undercover female agent trained in domestic violence scenarios. The real Sarah and her children would be safely housed at a federal facility until Derek and Linda were in custody. This substitution would protect my family while providing an opportunity to observe Derek's behavior when he thought he was implementing his plan successfully. I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread as we finalized the details. Derek had spent years systematically destroying my daughter's life, poisoning her body and mind, while planning to steal her children and her freedom. But his elaborate conspiracy was about to become his downfall. In 3 days, Derek and Linda would walk into my house expecting to execute the final phase of their scheme. Instead, they'd be walking into a federal sting operation designed to document their crimes and ensure their prosecution. The trap they'd set for Sarah was about to snap shut on them instead. The morning of our planned confrontation, federal agents transformed my quiet neighborhood into a carefully orchestrated surveillance operation. Patricia's team had spent 2 days installing hidden cameras in every room, embedding listening devices in furniture, and establishing communication networks that would allow real-time coordination between multiple agencies. Agent Jennifer Harrison, a 15-year veteran who specialized in undercover domestic violence operations, would replace Sarah during the dinner. Jennifer had been studying surveillance footage of Sarah's mannerism, speech patterns, and behavioral responses to Derek's intimidation tactics. Her performance needed to be convincing enough to draw Derek and Linda into revealing their criminal plans while avoiding the drug-laced food they would certainly bring. The real Sarah and her children were safely housed at a federal witness protection facility 40 miles outside Dallas. She'd been terrified about the risks involved in the sting operation, but I convinced her that catching Derek and Linda in the act was the only way to ensure they faced serious criminal charges that would keep them away from her permanently. Dr. Chen had confirmed that Sarah's system contained dangerous levels of 3 different psychiatric medications: lorazepam, haloperidol, and quetiapine. The combination was designed to cause sedation, confusion, and apparent psychotic symptoms that would support Derek's claims about her mental instability. The dosages were high enough to cause serious medical complications if continued long-term. Patricia's financial investigation had uncovered the full scope of Derek's embezzlement scheme. He'd been stealing from client accounts for 3 years, using sophisticated techniques to hide the theft and delay discovery. The total amount now exceeded $800,000, with funds hidden in banks across the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Luxembourg. Linda's role in the conspiracy was equally disturbing. Beyond stealing medications, she'd been creating false medical records documenting Sarah's supposed psychiatric history. These fabricated documents included emergency room visits that never happened, psychiatric evaluations that were never conducted, and medication prescriptions that were never legitimately issued. Linda had used her medical credentials to create an entirely fictional medical history that supported Derek's custody claims. The private psychiatric facility Derek had contacted, Riverside Mental Health Services, was also under investigation for accepting patients based on fraudulent commitments. Several families had filed complaints about relatives being held against their will based on questionable medical documentation. Derek's case would have been one of many where financial incentives motivated the facility to accept patients without proper legal justification. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Derek called to confirm dinner plans. His voice was tense but excited, suggesting he viewed this evening as the culmination of his long-term strategy. He mentioned bringing Linda to help mediate the family discussion and said they'd prepared special food to show their commitment to reconciliation. I played my role perfectly, expressing relief that he wanted to repair the family relationships and thanking him for bringing Linda to provide professional perspective on Sarah's recent behavioral changes. Derek interpreted my cooperation as confirmation that his manipulation tactics were working and that I'd been successfully convinced of Sarah's mental instability. Linda arrived first, carrying a covered casserole dish and a medical bag that she claimed contained anxiety medication for Sarah. Federal surveillance teams photographed her entering my house and documented the items she brought. Inside the casserole dish, we later discovered were mashed sweet potatoes laced with enough sedatives to incapacitate an adult woman for several hours. Derek arrived 30 minutes later with legal documents he claimed would help resolve custody questions if Sarah needed temporary medical care. The papers were actually commitment forms that would allow him to have Sarah involuntarily hospitalized for psychiatric evaluation. His plan was to drug her during dinner, document her impaired state, using hidden recording devices, and then present the evidence to authorities as justification for emergency intervention. Agent Harrison played her role flawlessly, appearing nervous and slightly confused while maintaining Sarah's characteristic speech patterns and mannerisms. Derek seemed pleased by her apparent vulnerability, interpreting her performance as evidence that his previous drug administration was still affecting her cognitive function. During dinner conversation, Linda began documenting the interaction with a small recording device, asking leading questions designed to elicit responses that could be edited to sound irrational or threatening. She inquired about Sarah's memory problems, her ability to care for the children safely, and whether she'd been having unusual thoughts about harming herself or others. Derek played the concerned husband perfectly, expressing worry about Sarah's recent behavioral changes and his fear that she might be becoming a danger to Tommy and Jake. He mentioned previous incidents where Sarah had allegedly acted erratically, stories that were either completely fabricated or grossly exaggerated versions of normal parenting challenges. The conversation took a sinister turn when Derek suggested that Sarah should consider getting help for her mental health issues. He produced brochures for Riverside Mental Health Services, emphasizing their expertise in treating women with postpartum psychological complications and their comfortable residential facilities that would allow Sarah to rest and recover while he cared for the children. Linda supported Derek's suggestions with professional authority, claiming that Sarah's symptoms indicated serious psychological distress that required immediate intervention. She offered to prescribe temporary anxiety medication that would help Sarah think more clearly about treatment options. The medication she produced was actually a powerful sedative that would have left Sarah completely incapacitated. Federal agents monitoring the conversation heard Derek and Linda explicitly discussing their plan to manipulate Sarah into voluntary commitment, or if necessary, to create evidence supporting involuntary hospitalization. They spoke openly about their research into psychiatric facilities, their consultation with commitment attorneys, and their preparation of documentation that would support their claims about Sarah's mental state. But the most damning evidence came when Derek's phone rang during dinner. Thinking he was speaking privately, he stepped into my kitchen to answer a call from his girlfriend, Candace. Federal recording devices captured his side of a conversation where he bragged about being hours away from getting rid of Sarah permanently and promised Candace that they'd be free to start their new life together once Sarah was safely locked away where she can't cause any more problems. When Derek returned to the dining room, his demeanor had shifted from concerned husband to predatory confidence. He began pressuring Agent Harrison to eat the drugged sweet potatoes, claiming they were her favorite comfort food, and expressing hurt that she wasn't appreciating Linda's cooking efforts. Agent Harrison skillfully deflected these attempts while appearing increasingly confused and disoriented, playing into Derek and Linda's expectations without actually consuming the contaminated food. Her performance was so convincing that Derek began documenting her apparent impairment with his phone, creating evidence he planned to use in commitment proceedings. The trap snapped shut when Derek explicitly stated his intention to have Sarah committed that evening. He produced the legal documents he'd prepared along with a phone number for emergency psychiatric transport services. Linda revealed that she'd already contacted Riverside Mental Health Services and arranged for Sarah to be admitted immediately following her psychological evaluation at my house. That's when federal agents surrounded the house and announced their presence. Derek's face went white as he realized that law enforcement had been monitoring his conversation and that his elaborate conspiracy had been thoroughly documented. Linda attempted to dispose of the stolen medications she'd brought, but agents had already photographed and cataloged everything. Derek initially tried to claim that he was attempting to help his mentally ill wife, but the recorded evidence of his conversation with Candace destroyed that defense. His statements about getting rid of Sarah permanently and starting a new life clearly demonstrated malicious intent rather than genuine concern for Sarah's welfare. Linda attempted to claim professional immunity, arguing that she was providing medical consultation within her scope of practice. But her theft of prescription medications and creation of false medical records constituted multiple felony violations that voided any professional protections. Both Derek and Linda were arrested on federal charges, including conspiracy fraud, medication trafficking, and attempted kidnapping. The evidence against them was overwhelming, with hours of recorded conversations, financial documentation of the embezzlement scheme, and physical evidence of the drugs they'd intended to use on Sarah. As Derek was led away in handcuffs, he looked directly at me with an expression of pure hatred. "You have no idea what you've done," he snarled. "Sarah will never be safe from me." I smiled calmly and replied, "Actually, Derek, you have no idea what you've done. You just confessed to federal crimes in front of a dozen law enforcement officers. Sarah will be perfectly safe because you'll be spending the next 20 years in federal prison." The sting operation had exceeded our expectations, providing irrefutable evidence of Derek and Linda's criminal conspiracy while protecting Sarah and her children from immediate harm. But this was just the beginning of the legal proceedings that would ultimately destroy Derek's life and ensure justice for my daughter. The aftermath of Derek and Linda's arrests created a media sensation that rippled through Dallas's legal and financial communities. Within hours of their booking, local news stations were reporting on the elaborate conspiracy involving embezzlement, prescription drug theft, and attempted psychiatric fraud. Derek's employer, Henderson Financial Group, immediately terminated him and hired forensic accountants to assess the full extent of the financial damage. Patricia's federal team worked around the clock to build an airtight prosecution case. The evidence was overwhelming: hours of recorded conversations proving criminal intent, financial records documenting systematic embezzlement, medical evidence of Sarah's drugging, and physical possession of controlled substances intended for further poisoning. Derek and Linda had essentially prosecuted themselves through their own documented admissions. The bail hearing 3 days later became a showcase of the conspiracy's scope and sophistication. Federal prosecutor David Rodriguez presented evidence that Derek had stolen nearly $800,000 from client accounts, using increasingly complex methods to hide the theft as his debts mounted. The prosecution argued that Derek posed an extreme flight risk given his access to offshore accounts and his demonstrated willingness to commit violent crimes to avoid consequences. I testified at the hearing detailing my investigation and the evidence that led to the sting operation. When I described Derek's assault on Sarah and his documented plans to have her involuntarily committed, several people in the courtroom gasped audibly. The judge's expression grew increasingly stern as the prosecutor presented Derek's internet search history, including queries about staged suicide methods and legal procedures for collecting life insurance after a spouse's death. But the most damning testimony came from Agent Harrison, who had witnessed Derek and Linda's conversation during the failed sting operation. She described Derek's excitement about permanently removing Sarah from his life and his detailed plans for gaining custody of the children while hiding stolen funds in international accounts. Derek's attorney attempted to portray him as a concerned husband who'd made poor financial decisions under stress, but the recorded evidence destroyed any sympathy defense. When Derek's conversation with Candace was played in court, revealing his callous attitude toward Sarah and his anticipation of starting a new life, even his own lawyer appeared shaken. The judge set Derek's bail at $2 million, an amount far beyond his legitimate financial resources. His assets were frozen pending restitution proceedings, and electronic monitoring was ordered if he somehow managed to make bail. Linda's bail was denied entirely due to her access to controlled substances and her demonstrated willingness to use medical credentials for criminal purposes. Within a week of their arrests, additional victims began coming forward. 3 women who had dated Derek before he met Sarah contacted federal investigators with stories of financial manipulation, identity theft, and psychological abuse. Derek had apparently refined his techniques through practice learning to identify vulnerable targets and exploit their trust more effectively. Linda's former colleagues at the medical practice reported suspicious incidents they'd previously attributed to administrative errors. Medication inventories that never balanced correctly patient records that mysteriously disappeared, and Linda's unusual interest in psychiatric medications now made perfect sense in light of her criminal activities. The investigation expanded to include Riverside Mental Health Services, the private facility that had agreed to accept Sarah based on Derek's fabricated documentation. Federal agents discovered that the facility had a pattern of accepting patients without proper legal justification, often in cases where families paid premium rates for discreet psychiatric care. Derek's girlfriend Candace initially cooperated with investigators, claiming ignorance about his criminal activities, but financial records revealed she'd been receiving expensive gifts purchased with embezzled funds, and recorded phone calls proved she was aware of Derek's plans to leave Sarah through medical intervention. Candace was ultimately charged as an accessory to conspiracy and fraud. The media attention intensified when it was revealed that I was a retired federal investigator who had used professional skills to protect my family. News outlets framed the story as a thriller narrative. Retired FBI agent uses federal resources to expose son-in-law's criminal conspiracy. Public interest was enormous, with many people expressing admiration for my determination to protect Sarah and her children. But I was more concerned about Sarah's emotional recovery than public recognition. She was struggling with feelings of guilt and shame, blaming herself for not recognizing Derek's manipulation sooner. Dr. Chen continued providing therapeutic support, helping Sarah understand that she'd been the victim of sophisticated psychological and chemical abuse designed to undermine her cognitive function. The children required extensive counseling to process what they'd experienced. Tommy had developed anxiety about his father's absence, while Jake was having nightmares about the night Derek assaulted Sarah. Dr. Martinez worked with both boys using age-appropriate techniques to help them understand that their father's behavior was wrong and that they were now safe. Sarah's medical recovery was equally challenging. The psychiatric medications Derek and Linda had been administering required careful withdrawal under medical supervision. Dr. Chen monitored Sarah's progress, closely documenting her cognitive improvement as the drugs cleared her system. Within 6 weeks, Sarah's mental clarity had returned completely, providing additional evidence of the chemical abuse she'd endured. The financial impact on Sarah was initially devastating. Derek's embezzlement scheme had left their family accounts empty, and their house was facing foreclosure due to the fraudulent second mortgage Derek had obtained. But federal victim compensation programs provided temporary support, and civil attorneys were pursuing recovery of stolen assets from Derek's hidden accounts. 3 months after the arrests, federal prosecutors offered plea deals to both Derek and Linda. Derek was facing 47 federal charges, including wire fraud, conspiracy money, laundering prescription drug trafficking, and attempted kidnapping. The prosecution recommended 30 years in federal prison if he pleaded guilty and cooperated with asset recovery efforts. Linda faced 32 charges related to prescription drug theft, practicing medicine without proper licensing, creation of false medical records, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Prosecutors recommended 20 years if she testified against Derek and provided information about other criminal activities. Derek rejected the plea offer, apparently believing his attorney could challenge the evidence or negotiate a better deal. This decision proved catastrophic when additional charges were filed based on evidence found in his hidden offshore accounts. Financial investigators discovered that Derek's embezzlement scheme dated back 5 years and involved multiple companies where he'd worked previously. Linda initially accepted her plea deal, agreeing to testify against Derek in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her cooperation revealed additional details about the conspiracy, including Derek's research into life insurance fraud and his consideration of more direct methods for eliminating Sarah if the psychiatric commitment plan failed. But Derek made one final desperate mistake that sealed his fate. During a court transport 3 days before his trial was scheduled to begin, he attempted to escape federal custody. Derek had apparently bribed a transport guard to leave his handcuffs loose and had researched the route between the jail and courthouse to identify escape opportunities. The escape attempt lasted less than 4 hours. Federal marshals tracked Derek to a storage unit where he'd hidden emergency cash and false identification documents. His capture was broadcast live on local television, with news helicopters following the manhunt through Dallas suburbs. The escape attempt destroyed any remaining sympathy Derek might have received and guaranteed maximum sentencing on all charges. Additional charges were filed for escape, assaulting federal officers, and violation of court orders. Derek's trial became a formality, with his own actions providing the strongest evidence of his criminal intent and danger to society. The trial lasted 3 weeks with prosecution witnesses, including federal agents, financial experts, medical professionals, and Derek's previous victims. Sarah's testimony was particularly powerful, describing her gradual realization that her memory problems and cognitive difficulties were chemically induced rather than symptoms of mental illness. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 49 charges. Derek showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, apparently having finally accepted that his elaborate schemes had completely failed. Linda's sentencing hearing occurred the following week. Despite her cooperation with prosecutors, she received 15 years in federal prison due to the severity of her medical crimes and the danger she'd posed to public safety. Her nursing license was permanently revoked, and she was barred from working in any medical capacity upon release. Derek's sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, giving the court time to review victim impact statements and assess the full scope of his criminal activities. Federal guidelines recommended between 25 and 35 years, but Derek's escape attempt and the attempted murder implications of his conspiracy suggested he would receive the maximum possible sentence. As we awaited Derek's final sentencing, Sarah began rebuilding her life with remarkable strength and determination. She'd enrolled in online nursing courses and was making plans to return to pediatric care once her studies were complete. The boys were thriving in therapy and showing no lasting psychological damage from their traumatic experiences. Derek's elaborate conspiracy had ultimately destroyed only himself, while the family he'd tried to demolate emerged stronger and more unified than ever. Justice was finally within reach, and Sarah's nightmare was approaching its end. Derek Thompson's sentencing hearing on March 15th became the culmination of 18 months of investigation, legal proceedings, and public fascination with one of Dallas's most elaborate criminal conspiracies. The federal courthouse was packed with media representatives, law enforcement officials, and members of the public who had followed the case through extensive news coverage. Federal Judge Margaret Williams presided over the hearing with the gravity appropriate to Derek's extensive criminal activities. The prosecution had prepared a comprehensive presentation documenting 49 felony convictions spanning financial fraud, domestic violence, conspiracy, drug trafficking, and attempted escape. The evidence filled 12 boxes and included over 600 pages of financial records, hundreds of hours of recorded conversations, and testimony from 27 witnesses. Prosecutor David Rodriguez began by outlining the scope of Derek's crimes, emphasizing the sophisticated planning and callous disregard for his victims that characterized every aspect of his conspiracy. Your Honor, the defendant didn't commit crimes of passion or desperation. He methodically planned the destruction of his wife's life over a period of several years, using psychological manipulation, chemical abuse, and financial fraud to achieve his goals. The prosecution presented evidence that Derek's embezzlement scheme had actually begun 6 months before he married Sarah, suggesting that marriage to a financially stable woman with excellent credit was part of his original criminal plan. Financial forensic experts testified that Derek had researched Sarah's family background, employment history, and credit rating before pursuing their relationship. Dr. Chen testified about the medical abuse Sarah had endured, explaining that the combination of psychiatric medications administered by Linda could have caused permanent neurological damage if continued long-term. The defendant and his accomplice were essentially conducting human experimentation, Dr. Chen stated. They were using controlled substances to alter Mrs. Thompson's cognitive function for their own criminal purposes. Agent Harrison described Derek's behavior during the sting operation, particularly his excitement about permanently removing Sarah from his life and his detailed knowledge of commitment procedures. The defendant displayed no remorse or concern for his wife's well-being. He spoke about destroying her life with the same casual tone most people use to discuss weekend plans. Sarah's victim impact statement was delivered with quiet strength that commanded absolute attention throughout the courtroom. She described the gradual erosion of her self-confidence, her confusion about memory problems and cognitive difficulties, and her terror about losing her children to someone she'd trusted completely. For 3 years, Derek systematically poisoned my body and my mind, Sarah testified. He made me doubt my own sanity, question my ability to care for my children, and believe that I was fundamentally flawed as a person. The physical abuse was traumatic, but the psychological manipulation was far more devastating because it attacked my sense of reality itself. Sarah also addressed Derek directly, speaking with a composure that demonstrated her complete recovery from his abuse. You tried to steal my children, my freedom, and my future. You failed because you underestimated my family's love and my mother's determination to protect me. I hope you spend every day of your prison sentence thinking about how your own arrogance led to your destruction. The boys had provided age-appropriate statements through child advocates describing their fear during Derek's assault and their relief at living safely with their mother and grandmother. Tommy wrote that he was happy Daddy can't hurt Mommy anymore, while Jake drew a picture of his family that pointedly excluded Derek entirely. Multiple previous victims testified about Derek's pattern of financial manipulation and psychological abuse. Jennifer Martinez described how Derek had stolen her identity to open credit accounts, then convinced her that she was responsible for debts she'd never incurred. Lisa Chen detailed Derek's systematic isolation tactics, including sabotaging her relationships with family and friends, to increase his control over her life. The financial impact assessment revealed that Derek's crimes had affected 43 victims across multiple states, with total losses exceeding $1.2 million. Many victims had suffered ruined credit ratings, bankruptcy, and ongoing psychological trauma from Derek's manipulation and abuse. Derek's defense attorney attempted to argue for leniency based on his client's childhood trauma and substance abuse issues, but Judge Williams rejected these explanations as insufficient justification for the scope and sophistication of his crimes. Mr. Thompson's actions demonstrate careful planning, meticulous execution, and complete disregard for his victims' welfare. These are not the behaviors of someone acting impulsively due to personal problems. The defense also attempted to minimize Derek's role in the medical abuse, claiming that Linda had acted independently in drugging Sarah. But recorded conversations proved that Derek had specifically requested medications to make Sarah appear mentally unstable, and he had researched the effects of combining different psychiatric drugs. When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Derek finally spoke publicly about his crimes. His statement was brief and showed no genuine remorse. "I made some poor decisions under financial pressure. I never intended for anyone to be seriously hurt. I hope the court will consider my cooperation with asset recovery efforts." Judge Williams responded with barely concealed disgust. "Mr. Thompson, your statement demonstrates the same manipulative dishonesty that characterized your treatment of every victim in this case. You didn't make poor decisions. You planned and executed a sophisticated criminal conspiracy designed to destroy your wife's life and steal money from dozens of innocent people." The judge then delivered Derek's sentence 35 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, followed by 10 years of supervised release. She also ordered Derek to pay full restitution to all victims, including Sarah's medical expenses, counseling costs, and compensation for pain and suffering. The defendant will serve his sentence in a maximum security federal facility, appropriate for violent offenders, Judge Williams announced. Given his demonstrated escape risk and the severity of his crimes against family members, he will not be eligible for minimum security placement or work release programs. Derek showed no visible reaction to the sentence, having apparently accepted that his criminal activities had finally caught up with him. He was immediately returned to federal custody and transported to a maximum security prison in Colorado, far from Texas and any remaining connections to his former life. Linda's cooperation with prosecution efforts had resulted in her 15-year sentence, but she was also ordered to pay significant restitution and surrender any remaining assets. Her nursing career was permanently ended, and she would be monitored closely upon release to ensure she never again had access to controlled substances or medical facilities. The civil proceedings against Derek and Linda continued for another 8 months, resulting in significant financial recovery for Sarah and other victims. Derek's hidden offshore accounts were located and frozen, with most of the stolen funds eventually returned to their rightful owners. Sarah received over $400,000 in restitution and civil damages, enough to secure her children's future and complete her nursing education. The case also prompted legislative changes in Texas regarding domestic violence prosecution and psychiatric commitment procedures. New laws strengthened requirements for involuntary commitment, created additional penalties for medical professionals, who abused their credentials and expanded resources for domestic violence victims seeking protection from financially sophisticated abusers. Derek's former employer, Henderson Financial Group, implemented comprehensive background verification procedures to prevent similar fraud schemes. The company also established a victim compensation fund for clients who had suffered losses due to Derek's embezzlement activities. Riverside Mental Health Services faced extensive investigation and reform requirements following their role in Derek's conspiracy. The facility's license was temporarily suspended while administrators implemented new protocols for patient admission and commitment verification. Several staff members were terminated for accepting patients without proper legal documentation. 3 years after Derek's sentencing, I learned that he'd been assaulted by fellow inmates who discovered his conviction for domestic violence and child endangerment. Derek sustained injuries requiring hospitalization and was subsequently placed in protective custody, effectively solitary confinement for his own safety. His elaborate schemes to manipulate and control others had ultimately left him powerless and isolated in the federal prison system. Linda served her sentence in a women's federal facility in California, participating in substance abuse programs and working in the prison laundry. She expressed genuine remorse for her role in Sarah's abuse and attempted to contact Sarah to apologize, but Sarah declined any communication with her former tormentor. Derek's criminal activities had destroyed not only his own life, but also the lives of his accomplices and victims. His mother would spend 15 years in prison for following his criminal plan. His girlfriend had been convicted of conspiracy and received 5 years probation, and dozens of financial fraud victims continued dealing with the aftermath of his theft and manipulation. But for Sarah, Tommy, Jake, and me, Derek's downfall represented the end of a nightmare and the beginning of a new chapter filled with hope, safety, and the knowledge that justice had been completely and thoroughly served. 5 years have passed since that horrific Sunday dinner when Derek revealed his true nature by striking my daughter in my own home. As I sit in my kitchen this morning watching Sarah prepare breakfast for Tommy and Jake before their school day begins, I'm overwhelmed by gratitude for how profoundly our lives have changed. Sarah completed her master's degree in pediatric nursing 2 years ago, graduating summa cum laude, despite the challenges of balancing motherhood recovery from trauma and intensive academic demands. She now works as a nurse practitioner at Children's Medical Center of Dallas, specializing in emergency pediatric care. Her colleagues describe her as exceptionally compassionate with young patients, though they don't know that her empathy comes from personal experience with healing from trauma. The children have thrived beyond my most optimistic expectations. Tommy, now 11, plays soccer and violin, excelling in both athletics and academics. He remembers the night Derek hurt his mother, but therapy helped him understand that his father's behavior was wrong and not a reflection of normal family dynamics. Jake, 9 years old, shows artistic talent and maintains an infectious optimism that suggests no lasting psychological damage from his early experiences. Sarah purchased a beautiful 4-bedroom house in Preston Hollow using restitution money from Derek's criminal conviction and our successful civil lawsuit. The house has a large backyard where the boys play with their golden retriever Buddy, whom Sarah adopted from a rescue organization. Sunday family dinners continue at my house, but now they're filled with laughter, genuine conversation, and the security that comes from knowing we're all safe. 18 months ago, Sarah began dating Dr. Marcus Williams, a pediatric cardiologist who works at the same hospital. Marcus treats Tommy and Jake as his own sons, attending their sporting events and school functions with genuine enthusiasm. He proposed to Sarah last Christmas, and they're planning a small wedding ceremony this summer. The boys are excited about gaining a stepfather who truly loves their mother and respects their family bonds. My role as protective grandmother has evolved into something more collaborative and supportive. Sarah makes her own decisions now, confident in her judgment and secure in her independence. She consults me about important choices, but as an equal partner in family discussions rather than someone seeking permission or validation. The trauma recovery process taught our family valuable lessons about communication, trust, and resilience. We talk openly about Derek's abuse and the ways it affected all of us, including me. I realized that my federal investigator training, while useful for gathering evidence and protecting my family, had also made me somewhat controlling in my approach to helping Sarah heal. Through family counseling, I learned to balance my protective instincts with respect for Sarah's autonomy and decision-making capabilities. Sarah needed to rebuild her confidence through her own choices and achievements, not through my continued intervention in every aspect of her life. The boys understand an age-appropriate version of their father's crimes and the reasons he's in federal prison. Dr. Martinez helped Sarah explain that Derek made very bad choices that hurt people, including their mother, and that he's serving the consequences for those choices. They know they're safe now, and that Derek will never be able to harm their family again. Derek continues serving his 35-year sentence at ADX Florence, a supermax federal prison in Colorado. He's been placed in administrative segregation for his own protection after several violent incidents with other inmates. His appeals have been consistently denied, and he has no realistic possibility of early release. Linda was released from federal prison last year after serving 12 years of her 15-year sentence. She moved to Oregon, where she works at a convenience store and lives in a modest apartment. She's prohibited from any employment involving controlled substances or medical care. By all accounts, she's accepted responsibility for her crimes and lives quietly without attempting to contact our family. I've used my experience with Derek's case to help other families facing similar situations. I volunteer with the Dallas Area Domestic Violence Coalition, providing guidance to women whose abusers are using financial manipulation or legal intimidation as control tactics. My federal law enforcement background helps these families understand their options and navigate complex legal procedures. 3 years ago, I published a book titled When Charm Becomes Control, a federal investigator's guide to recognizing financial and emotional abuse. The book combines practical advice with case studies, including Derek's conspiracy to help readers identify warning signs of sophisticated manipulation and abuse. The book became a resource for law enforcement training programs and domestic violence organizations nationwide. I speak regularly at conferences for federal investigators, social workers, and legal professionals about recognizing the intersection between financial crimes and domestic abuse. My speaking engagements allow me to honor the law enforcement colleagues who helped protect Sarah and bring Derek to justice. Patricia Flores was promoted to supervisory special agent in charge of the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Agent Harrison continues working undercover domestic violence cases and has received commendations for her role in our sting operation. The legislative changes prompted by Derek's case have helped protect other families from similar conspiracies. Texas now requires 2 independent medical evaluations before involuntary psychiatric commitment, making it much harder for abusers to manipulate the mental health system against their victims. Enhanced penalties for medical professionals who abuse their credentials have deterred other potential Linda Thompsons from participating in criminal conspiracies. Background verification requirements for financial services employees have prevented several embezzlement schemes similar to Derek's operation. But beyond the legal and social policy improvements, Derek's case taught our family profound lessons about the importance of trusting our instincts, supporting each other unconditionally, and using whatever resources we have to protect the people we love. I learned that my federal investigator training was valuable not just for building cases and gathering evidence, but for teaching my family that dangerous people can be defeated when their victims refuse to be intimidated or silenced. Derek's sophisticated manipulation tactics were no match for systematic investigation and determined resistance. Sarah learned that her strength and intelligence, which Derek had tried so hard to undermine, were actually the qualities that enabled her survival and recovery. She discovered that asking for help isn't weakness. It's strategic thinking that multiplies your resources and capabilities. The boys learned that families protect each other, that adults can be trusted to keep children safe, and that people who hurt others face real consequences for their actions. They've grown up understanding that respect, kindness, and honesty are non-negotiable values in healthy relationships. Our experience also taught us the critical importance of recognizing warning signs that we'd initially dismissed or rationalized. Derek's charm, his explanations for Sarah's isolation, his control over family finances, and his subtle undermining of Sarah's confidence were all red flags that we should have taken more seriously. For other families dealing with similar situations, I want to emphasize that sophisticated abusers like Derek rely on their victims' isolation and self-doubt. They succeed when their victims believe they're alone, powerless, or somehow responsible for the abuse they're enduring. But abusers fail when their victims have strong support systems, access to professional resources, and the knowledge that their experiences are believed and taken seriously. Derek's elaborate conspiracy collapsed because Sarah had a mother who understood investigation techniques and federal agents who believed her story. Most importantly, Derek's downfall proves that abusers aren't as clever as they think they are. Their arrogance and need for control often lead them to create evidence of their own crimes and underestimate their victims' capabilities and resources. Every family dealing with abuse has access to some form of help, whether through law enforcement, social services, legal advocacy, or community support organizations. The key is recognizing that reaching out for help isn't giving up or admitting defeat. It's strategic thinking that gives you advantages your abuser doesn't expect. As I watch Sarah laugh with Marcus while they plan their wedding, and as I see Tommy and Jake growing into confident, secure young men, I'm reminded that survivors don't just endure trauma. They can emerge stronger, wiser, and more determined to protect others from similar experiences. Derek tried to destroy my daughter's life and steal her future. Instead, his criminal conspiracy became the catalyst for Sarah's transformation into a healthcare professional who helps children every day, a confident mother who raises secure sons, and a woman who knows her own worth and refuses to accept anything less than genuine love and respect. Justice wasn't just served when Derek received his prison sentence. Justice is served every day that Sarah lives freely pursuing her dreams and building the life she chooses. Justice is served when Tommy and Jake grow up, understanding that healthy relationships require mutual respect and genuine care. Justice is served when other families learn from our experience and recognize dangerous situations before they escalate to violence. The Derek Thompsons of this world succeed only when their victims remain silent and isolated. They fail when communities support survivors, when professionals take abuse seriously, and when families refuse to let manipulators divide and conquer them. My federal investigator training taught me that criminals make mistakes because their arrogance leads them to underestimate their opponents. Derek's biggest mistake was targeting a family that refused to be destroyed, had access to resources he didn't know existed, and was willing to fight back using every tool at our disposal. Our story demonstrates that families can overcome even the most sophisticated abuse and manipulation when they work together, seek professional help, and refuse to give up on each other. Derek's elaborate conspiracy ultimately served only to unite our family more strongly and prove that love, determination, and strategic thinking can triumph over even the most calculated evil. Now, I'd like to ask you something important. Have you ever noticed warning signs of manipulation or control in your own relationships or those of people you care about? Sometimes the most dangerous abusers are the ones who seem most charming and helpful on the surface. If our story resonates with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to stay connected with content that might help you or someone you know recognize these critical warning signs before it's too late. Share this story with others who might benefit from understanding how sophisticated abusers operate and how families can protect themselves. Most importantly, comment below if you've experienced similar situations or if you have questions about recognizing manipulation and abuse in your own life. Your engagement helps these important stories reach more people who need to hear them, and your shared experiences might provide exactly the insight someone else needs to recognize their own dangerous situation. Thank you for listening to our family's journey from trauma to triumph. I hope our experience gives you confidence that even the most calculated abusers can be defeated when their victims refuse to remain silent and seek the help they deserve. May you and your loved ones always have the strength to protect each other and the wisdom to recognize when protection is needed. Remember, you're stronger than you know. Help is available when you need it, and no one has the right to control, manipulate, or harm you regardless of their relationship to you. Stay safe, stay strong, and never hesitate to reach out when something doesn't feel right.